Tonight, we wander through a world where such things made perfect sense, where superstition was not ignorance, but logic applied to mysteries that had no other explanation, where the strange was simply ordinary. The medieval world was not our world. To enter it is to cross a threshold into a place where the rules we know dissolve like morning mist, where the familiar becomes strange and the strange becomes the only truth available. The people who lived in those centuries were not less intelligent than we are. They were not primitive. They were human beings, fully human, as curious and as frightened and as hopeful as anyone who has ever lived, navigating a world filled with forces they could not see, could not measure, could not control. They had no microscopes to reveal the bacteria that killed their children, no weather satellites to explain the storms that destroyed their crops, no psychology to name the conditions that made some minds wander into darkness. What they had instead was pattern. What they had was observation passed down through generations. What they had was faith, in God, in tradition, in the accumulated wisdom of grandmothers who remembered what their grandmothers had told them about how to survive in a world that offered so few guarantees. And so they developed beliefs that we now call superstitions. They hung horseshoes above their doors to ward off witches. They covered mirrors when someone died so souls would not become trapped. They believed that the seventh son of a seventh son could heal with his touch, that mandrake roots screamed when pulled from the earth, that bread blessed by a priest could reveal a thief by the simple act of choking him. These beliefs were not random. They followed their own internal logic. They addressed real fears with the tools available to minds that had not yet been given the explanations we take for granted. To dismiss them as foolishness is to miss what they truly were: humanity's attempt to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in suffering, to believe that the universe was not indifferent, but was instead a place where actions had consequences, where protection was possible, where the invisible forces that shaped life could be understood, and perhaps, with the right words, the right rituals, the right objects, hung in the right places, controlled. Tonight we wander through that world, not to mock it, not to feel superior to it, but to understand it, to sit with the fears that shaped it, to honor the hopes that sustained it, to recognize in those distant ancestors something of ourselves. For we too seek patterns. We too fear what we cannot explain. We too perform small rituals, knocking on wood, avoiding the number 13, crossing our fingers, that echo across centuries from a time when such gestures were not superstition, but survival. The night is long. The medieval world awaits. Let us enter it slowly, gently, with the respect owed to those who came before us, and the humility owed to mysteries that remain mysteries still. Let the strangeness settle around us like a familiar blanket. Let the distance between their world and ours grow smaller with each passing chapter. And let us remember as sleep approaches that the border between belief and knowledge has always been thinner than we imagine, that what we know today was once what we believed, and what we believe today may one day be known, or may be recognized as the superstition of an age that thought itself enlightened. The candles are lit. The threshold is crossed. The medieval night begins. In the stone towers of medieval churches, bronze bells hung in darkness, waiting. They waited through still afternoons, when the sky was clear and birds sang in the orchards below. They waited through the quiet watches of the night when only monks stirred in their prayers. But when clouds gathered on the horizon, when the first distant rumble announced that something was coming, the bells found their purpose, and men climbed the narrow stairs, gripped the heavy ropes, and began to ring. They were not merely announcing a storm, they were fighting one. The medieval mind understood thunder and lightning differently than we do. Where we see atmospheric pressure and electrical discharge, they saw warfare. Cosmic warfare waged between heaven and the forces of darkness. Storms were not weather, they were assault. Demons rode the clouds, hurled hail upon crops, struck churches with lightning as acts of defiance against God. And the bells, consecrated by bishops, anointed with holy oils inscribed with prayers and the names of saints, were weapons against that darkness. The logic was precise. Sound, they believed, had power over the invisible world. The ringing of a blessed bell could fracture the air, could shatter the concentration of malevolent spirits, could scatter the demonic forces that gathered within the thunderheads. Each toll was an exorcism made audible. Each peal was a prayer that traveled upward to pierce the veil between the mortal world and whatever lurked beyond it. Church bells were not merely cast, they were baptized. Ceremonies survive in medieval manuscripts describing the ritual. The bell was washed, anointed with chrism, given a name like a child entering the faith. Some bells were named for saints whose protection they would invoke. Others bore inscriptions that promised their power. I break the lightning. I scatter the winds. I call the living. I mourn the dead. The words were carved into bronze that would outlast the hands that made it, the voices that blessed it, the generations that would ring it in times of terror. And the terror was real. Medieval people lived close to the land in ways we can barely imagine. A single hailstorm could destroy a year's harvest. A lightning strike could burn a barn filled with winter grain, could kill livestock, could set an entire village ablaze in an age when buildings were timber and thatch and water came from wells that took time to draw. The economic devastation was absolute. The spiritual interpretation was inevitable. Something had attacked them. Something had to be fought. So when thunder rolled across the darkening fields, the bell ringers climbed their towers and rang. They rang through the wind and the rain. They rang as lightning flashed closer. They rang with the desperate faith of those who believed that the sound of sacred bronze could push back the tide of darkness, could remind the demons that this place was protected, that God's servants would not yield without a fight. The tragedy is that they died. They died by the hundreds across the centuries, struck by the very lightning they sought to banish. The bell towers were the highest points in most villages, and the bell ringers stood within them, gripping wet ropes connected to metal bells. During electrical storms, they were perfect conductors. They were perfect targets. Church records from across Europe document the deaths. Ringers found slumped beside their ropes. Ringers whose bodies bore the branching marks that lightning leaves upon flesh. Ringers who gave their lives in service to a belief that could not protect them. Yet the practice continued. For centuries it continued. Because faith is not measured by survival. Because the deaths were interpreted not as proof that the bells failed, but as evidence that the battle was real, that the demons were strong, that the fallen ringers were martyrs who had given everything in defense of their communities. Because to stop ringing would be to surrender, to admit that the storms could not be fought, that the villages lay helpless beneath a sky that cared nothing for their prayers. Some regions developed elaborate protocols. In parts of Germany, the bells were rung in specific sequences, believed to be most effective against particular types of storms. In France, certain bells were considered more powerful than others, their reputations spreading across provinces, their names spoken with reverence by those who had survived storms that struck neighboring villages while sparing their own. The correlation was enough. The belief was sustained. It was not until the 18th century when Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod offered an alternative protection, one that actually worked, that directed electrical current safely into the ground, that the practice began to fade. But it faded slowly. Some communities resisted the new technology, seeing it as a lack of faith, as a surrender to worldly solutions when spiritual ones should suffice. The bells had protected their ancestors. The bells would protect them still. Today, the bells hang silent in towers across Europe. Some are still rung to mark the hours, to call the faithful, to celebrate weddings and mourn the dead. But they no longer ring against thunder. The storms pass overhead, and no one climbs the narrow stairs with wet rope in hand, with prayer on their lips, with the belief that bronze and faith together could hold back the sky, yet something lingers. When storms gather and the wind rises, when lightning flickers on the horizon, and the ancient bells sway slightly in their cradles, one might imagine for a moment that they remember, that they wait still for the hands that once gripped their ropes, that they hold within their bronze the echoes of all those peals sent upward into darkness, all those prayers made audible, all that desperate human courage facing forces it could not understand but refused to surrender to. The bells that warded off thunder, the faith that rang through storms, the silence that remains when the ringing ends and the rain continues falling on villages that survive now through different protections, different understandings, different ways of facing the darkness that still gathers in the clouds above us all. In the dim light of medieval justice, where truth hid behind silence and guilt wore the same face as innocence, there existed a practice so strange it seems born from dream rather than from law. It was called cruentation, from the Latin cruentare, to make bloody, and it rested upon a belief that would seem impossible to us now, that a murdered body remembered who killed it and would bleed afresh when the murderer drew near. The dead, it was believed, retained a flicker of awareness. The blood, it was said, testified. Picture a village square in 13th century Germany. A body lies upon a bier, cold for days now, the wounds that killed it visible to all. The suspect stands nearby, brought by constables who have found no other evidence, who have heard whispers but cannot prove what whispers suggest. The crowd gathers, the priest prays, and then the suspect is led forward, is made to touch the corpse, a hand upon the chest, fingers upon the wound, while the witnesses watch and wait for the dead to speak. And sometimes the records tell us the dead did speak. Blood flowed from wounds that had been dry. Fluid seeped from flesh that had been still. The body moved or seemed to move, as if recoiling from the touch it recognized. The crowd gasped. The verdict was rendered. The murderer was revealed by the victim itself, by testimony that no living witness could provide. The practice was not folk superstition alone. It was law. Legal codes in Germany, Scotland, England, and across continental Europe formally recognized cruentation as evidence. Court records survive documenting cases where the bleeding of a corpse was cited in verdicts, where men and women were condemned because a body seemed to respond to their presence. King James I of England, who would later commission the translation of the Bible that bears his name, wrote about cruentation in his treatise on witchcraft, affirming its validity, explaining the theology that made it possible. That theology was intricate. The medieval understanding held that the soul departed the body slowly, not all at once. For some time after death, hours, days, perhaps longer in cases of violent ending, something of the person remained. The body was not merely empty vessel, but was a kind of threshold, a space between life and death where the departed spirit might still perceive, might still remember, might still seek the justice that violent death demanded. The blood was the life, as Scripture said, and the blood remembered. There was also the doctrine of divine providence. God, it was believed, would not permit murder to go unpunished. The universe was moral. Actions had consequences that extended beyond what human courts could discover. If human witnesses failed, if human investigation could not find the truth, then God Himself would provide evidence. Through miracles, through signs, through the bleeding of wounds that accused the guilty hand that had made them. The practice seems cruel to us now, and it was. Imagine the terror of the accused, guilty or innocent, being forced to approach the body, to touch the cold flesh, knowing that coincidence or decay or the expectations of the watching crowd might condemn them regardless of truth. Bodies do things after death. Fluids shift. Gases build. Pressure changes position. What the medieval eye interpreted as accusation might have been nothing more than the natural processes of decomposition, triggered by movement, by temperature, by the simple fact that bodies are not stable things. But to Key, this is not to dismiss the belief. The people who practiced cruentation were not fools. They were searching for truth in a world that offered few tools for finding it. They had no forensic science, no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis. They had only the evidence of their eyes, the testimony of witnesses who might lie, and the faith that God would not abandon them to uncertainty. Cruentation was an attempt to reach beyond human limitation, to access a form of truth that transcended the failures of human investigation. And perhaps sometimes it worked, not through supernatural intervention, but through psychology. The guilty, believing that the corpse would reveal them, might tremble, might hesitate, might behave in ways that confirmed suspicion. The innocent, confident in their innocence, might approach without fear. The expectation of revelation might create the conditions for revelation, not because the dead spoke, but because the living could not help but answer. The practice faded as the centuries passed. By the Enlightenment, cruentation had become embarrassment to legal systems that aspired to rationality. The last recorded cases appear in the 17th century, relics of a worldview that was giving way to different assumptions about evidence, about proof, about the relationship between the natural and supernatural worlds. The corpse became merely corpse, evidence to be examined by physicians rather than consulted like oracles. But something of the old belief persists. We still speak of murder crying out for justice. We still feel that the dead deserve answers, that violent death creates a kind of debt that must be paid. We still hope in some deep part of ourselves that the truth will come to light, that the universe is not indifferent to justice, that wrongs will be righted, that the guilty will be revealed even when human investigation fails. The corpse that bled before its murderer, the dead that testified, the justice sought in a world where justice was hard to find and harder to prove. The medieval belief has faded, but the longing beneath it remains. The hope that truth is knowable, that innocence can be vindicated, that the silence of death is not the final silence, that somewhere, somehow, the murdered still remember who killed them. In the borderlands of Wales and the western reaches of England, in the valleys where mist gathered thick and the old ways lingered long after they had faded elsewhere, there existed figures who walked between worlds. They were outcasts, dwelling at the edges of villages that needed them but would not claim them. They were called sin-eaters, and their service was as sacred as it was reviled. For a small payment and a piece of bread, they consumed the sin of the recently dead. Picture a cottage in the Welsh hills. A body lies upon the bed, still warm. The family gathered in grief and in fear. Not fear of death alone. Death was familiar, was constant companion in an age when illness took the young and age came early. The fear was deeper. Fear for the soul that had departed, for the journey it must now make, for the weight of transgression it carried. For who among the living dies without sin? Who passes through life without cruelty, without lies, without the small failures that accumulate like dust? The family sends word to the margins of the village, to a hut where the sin-eater dwells alone. He comes at twilight, always at twilight, between day and night, between the world of the living and whatever waits beyond. He enters the cottage without greeting, approaches the body without prayer. Bread is placed upon the chest of the corpse, sometimes with ale or salt. The sin-eater takes it. He eats it. He swallows. And in that swallowing, the sins of the departed transfer to him. The lies, the angers, the lusts, the envies, all the unnamed shames that the dying could not confess, all the failures that clung to the soul like chains, all of it passes from the dead into the living, from the one who has escaped into the one who remains. The family pays what has been agreed. The sin-eater leaves. The departed soul rises lighter now, freed from the burden that might have dragged it down to darker places. And the sin-eater returns to his hut at the village edge, carrying within him the weight of another's failures, adding them to the accumulation of all the sins he has consumed before. The theology of the practice was never officially sanctioned by the Church. Indeed, the Church condemned it when it noticed it at all. But the belief that sin was almost physical, that it could be absorbed and transferred, ran deep in medieval thought. Christ himself had taken on the sins of humanity, had borne them, had suffered for them, had made redemption possible through his own flesh. The sin-eater was a kind of dark mirror of this salvation, a human figure doing on a small scale what the divine had done on a cosmic one. But the mirror was dark indeed. The sin-eater was not honored for his service. He was shunned. Contaminated by the sins he had consumed, he could not enter the church, could not share the communion table, could not walk freely among those whose burdens he had taken. He was necessary. Families desperate to ease the passage of their loved ones would not abandon the practice, but he was untouchable. He was reviled for the very service that gave him purpose. And when the sin-eater himself died, there was no one to eat for him, no one to take the sins he had accumulated, his own and those of all the others he had served. He was buried without ceremony, often in unconsecrated ground, left to face whatever judgment awaited alone, carrying the weight of the entire community's failures into whatever darkness received him. The practice persisted longer than we might expect. Records of sin-eating appear into the 18th and even 19th centuries, traces of a belief that refused to die even as the world around it changed. The last known sin-eater, Richard Munslow, died in 1906 in Shropshire, England. He was not outcast. By then, the practice had become more memorial than magical, a tradition rather than a literal transaction. But his tombstone was restored in 2010, a recognition that something important had been lost, that his strange service deserved remembrance. What are we to make of the sin-eaters? To dismiss them as superstition misses their profound humanity. They addressed a real fear, the fear that our failures will follow us beyond death, that the weight we carry in life will burden us in whatever comes after. They offered comfort to the grieving, assurance that the departed would not face judgment alone, that someone had taken the burden, that love could provide this final service, even when the beloved was beyond reach. And they remind us that every community has those who carry burdens for others. The therapists who listen to trauma, the priests who hear confessions, the caregivers who absorb the suffering of those they tend. The work changes form, but the pattern persists. Some among us take on the darkness, so that others might walk lighter. The sin-eater's hut stands empty now. The bread is no longer placed upon the chest. The sins of the dying go with them unabsorbed, or are addressed through different rituals, different theologies, different ways of hoping that death is not merely ending. But somewhere in the borderlands, where mist gathers and the old ways are not entirely forgotten, the memory of those solitary figures lingers, the ones who came at twilight, who swallowed what others could not bear, who carried the weight of transgression so that others might be free. When death visited a medieval household, and death visited often, was familiar guest at every hearth, one of the first acts was not prayer alone. Before the candles were lit, before the body was washed, before the mourning began in earnest, someone would move through the house attending to the mirrors. Every reflective surface was covered with cloth. Every glass was turned to face the wall. Every basin of water was emptied, lest it catch and hold what should be released. For the people of that age believed mirrors were dangerous. Not in themselves. In daily use they were simply tools, aids to vanity, luxuries that the wealthy displayed and the poor lived without. But in the presence of death, mirrors became something else. They became gateways. They became traps. They became surfaces thin enough for souls to pass through, and once passed through, to become ensnared. The logic was intricate. The medieval understanding of reflection was not ours. They saw the image in the glass and wondered, what is this double? This shadow self that moves when I move, that watches when I watch, that seems to breathe when I breathe. The reflection was mystery before science explained it, was phenomenon that suggested depths beyond the surface, was proof that the visible world contained dimensions that ordinary sight could not fully penetrate. If the reflection contained something of the self, some fragment, some echo, some portion of the soul made visible, then what happened when the body died? The soul was departing, was beginning its journey to judgment and whatever lay beyond. But the reflection remained. The mirror still held the image of what had been. And if the departing soul glimpsed itself in that glass, if it saw what it was leaving behind, If it paused to gaze upon its own fading form, might it not become confused? Might it not become trapped? Might it not linger in the reflection, unable to complete its passage, caught between worlds in a prison of silver and glass? The variations across regions were many. In some traditions, it was believed the deceased might see their reflection and refuse to depart, might become attached to the image that still showed them as they had been in life, might remain as ghost or revenant haunting the house they could not leave. In others, the danger was to the living. Those who glimpsed themselves in a mirror during mourning risked drawing death's attention, risked weakening their own souls through proximity to the departed, risked being pulled toward the threshold that their loved one had crossed. Some believed the mirror might capture the soul entirely, not merely delay it, not merely confuse it, but trap it permanently. Hold it in endless reflection, neither alive nor properly dead, unable to reach heaven or find rest, condemned to exist within the glass until the mirror itself was shattered, releasing whatever it had caught into uncertain freedom. The covering of mirrors spread beyond death itself. Some traditions required mirrors to be covered during sleep, lest the soul that wanders during dreams become lost in reflection. Others covered mirrors during illness, protecting the weakened soul from surfaces that might steal what little strength remained. The mirror became a site of vulnerability, a place where the boundary between self and image, between soul and shadow, between the world we inhabit and the worlds we cannot see grew dangerously thin. The wealthy had more to fear. They had more mirrors, more surfaces, more opportunities for souls to be caught. The poor had fewer concerns, their cottages containing little that reflected clearly, their losses mourned without the ritual of covering, because there was nothing to cover. The superstition was, in this way, tied to status, to the luxury goods that marked prosperity and the anxieties that accompanied them. When did the mirrors become safe again? After the mourning period ended, a period that varied by region and by the relationship to the deceased. The cloths were removed, the mirrors were uncovered, the household returned to normal. The danger passed, the soul presumably departed to its proper destination. But one wonders what the family felt in that moment of uncovering. Did they peer into the glass with fear, searching for some trace of the one who had died? Did they feel relief when only their own faces looked back? Did they trust that the precaution had worked? Or did doubt linger, a quiet wonder whether something remained that should have been released? The practice has faded, but has not entirely vanished. In some Jewish traditions, mirrors are still covered during Shiva, the week of mourning, though the explanations offered now tend toward psychology rather than soul-catching, suggesting that mourners should not be concerned with appearance during grief, that vanity has no place in loss. The form persists while the content has changed, the gesture echoing across centuries from a time when the explanation was literal, when the danger was real, when mirrors were not merely glass but gateways that required vigilance. And perhaps something of the old understanding lingers in how we feel about our reflection still. The slight unease of catching our own eye unexpectedly. The sense that the figure in the mirror is not quite us, is somehow other, is watching, rather than merely reflecting. The persistent cultural tropes of mirrors as portals, as prisons, as surfaces that might show us more than we wish to see, or might take more than we wish to give. The mirrors that held trapped souls. the covering and uncovering, the fear that reflection might become prison. The medieval mind knew that surfaces could be deceptive, that what seems solid might be passage, that the boundary between self and image is thinner than we imagine. The mirrors are uncovered now, but in the moment of loss, when death visits and the world shifts beneath our feet, we might still glance at our reflection and wonder, briefly, what else might be looking back. Across Europe, in an age when fear wore the face of the ordinary, when the neighbor who had always seemed strange became suspect, when misfortune demanded explanation, and explanation demanded a culprit, the witch hunters searched for proof upon the body itself. They believed that Satan marked his servants. Somewhere on the flesh of anyone who had made compact with the devil, there would be a sign, a mole, a scar, a patch of skin different from the rest. And this mark, unlike natural flesh, would feel no pain and would shed no blood when pierced. And so the pricking began. Picture a woman in a dim chamber, a woman who has been accused, who has been dragged from her home by neighbors she once trusted, who stands now before men who hold her fate in their hands. The examination begins. She is stripped, modesty abandoned, in the search for evidence that will condemn or save. Every inch of skin is scrutinized. Every irregularity is noted. The birthmark on her shoulder, the mole upon her back, the scar from a childhood burn. Any of these might be the devil's signature, the visible proof of invisible covenant. The pricker approaches. Sometimes he is a professional, a man who has made career of finding witches, who travels from town to town offering his services, who is paid for each witch that he identifies. He carries long needles, sometimes concealed in handles, sometimes displayed openly as tools of righteous investigation. He approaches the suspect. He places the needle against the mark. He pushes. If she cries out, if blood flows, the mark is natural. She has passed this test, though others may await. But if she does not cry out, if no blood appears, then the mark is proven. Satan has touched her there. She has given herself to darkness. The evidence is written upon her own body, testimony that no words can refute. The terrible science of this superstition operated on multiple levels. First, there were the natural phenomena misinterpreted as diabolical. Birthmarks are common. Moles appear on almost every body. Scars from illness, from work, from the ordinary accidents of life. All these marked medieval bodies, which knew neither dermatology nor understanding of how skin naturally varied and healed. Any such mark, in the charged atmosphere of a witch trial, became potentially damning. Then there were the tricks of the prickers themselves. Some used retractable needles, devices designed to seem to penetrate, but actually to collapse into their handles, producing no pain and no blood, regardless of where they were applied. These professional witch-finders were paid by conviction. Their income depended on finding guilt. The retractable needle guaranteed that they would find what they were paid to find, would discover the devil's mark on anyone they examined, would condemn the innocent with tools designed for deception. And there was the psychology of the examination itself. Shock numbs. Terror numbs. The dissociation that trauma produces can make the body feel distant, can reduce sensation, can make pain seem to come from far away. A woman who had been stripped, who had been handled, who had been accused of crimes that carried death. Such a woman might not feel the needle, might not cry out, might not bleed because her body had retreated from the horror of what was happening to it. The examination created the conditions for the result it sought. The records preserve the names of those who died. In Scotland, where witch hunting was particularly intense, thousands were executed, most of them women, many of them elderly, many of them merely different in ways that drew suspicion. The mark upon their skin, whether natural or found through fraud, became the evidence that justified their deaths. Their bodies testified against them or were made to testify, and the testimony was accepted by courts that believed themselves to be defending Christian society against genuine supernatural threat. How do we understand such belief? Not as simple cruelty, though cruelty was its instrument. The people who pricked, who examined, who condemned genuinely believed in the existence of witches, genuinely believed that Satan was active in the world, genuinely believed that the marks they found were real evidence of real compacts with real evil. They were wrong, tragically, murderously wrong, but they were not cynical. They thought they were protecting their communities. They thought they were doing God's work. The witch trials faded as the centuries passed, as Enlightenment skepticism challenged the assumptions that had sustained them. The last executions for witchcraft in Europe occurred in the 18th century. The pricking needles were put away. The professional witch-finders lost their profession. The marks upon the skin became merely marks again, birthmarks and moles and scars that meant nothing beyond the ordinary variations of human flesh. But something of the old fear persists in how we treat bodies still. The search for visible signs of invisible corruption. The assumption that the body reveals the soul. The tendency to interpret physical difference as moral failing. To read character from appearance. To find guilt in the flesh of those we have already decided to suspect. The witch's mark is gone, but the impulse that created it, the desire to find upon the body the proof of what we fear in the spirit, remains with us, transformed but not extinguished. The marks, the needles, the skin that could condemn. The medieval body was text to be read by fear, surface upon which suspicion could find confirmation. The pricking has ended, but the impulse to find visible evidence for invisible guilt, to locate on the body the signs of what we cannot otherwise prove, this remains, a shadow of the witch trials lingering in how we judge and are judged, in how the body speaks even when we wish it would be silent. In cottages across medieval Europe, or when a healthy infant suddenly sickened, when a cheerful child became listless and strange, when the baby who had nursed so eagerly now turned from the breast with eyes that seemed to belong to someone else, parents faced a terror beyond ordinary illness. This was not natural sickness, they believed. This was theft. Their true child had been stolen in the night, replaced while they slept by something else, a changeling, a fairy creature left in exchange, a withered and hungry thing that wore their baby's face, but was not their baby at all. The belief was widespread and ancient. It appeared in Germanic traditions, in Celtic folklore, in Scandinavian tales, in stories from every region where people told stories about the hidden folk, the fairies, the elves, the beings who lived in hills and forests and waters, who were not human but who watched humans with interest, with envy, with hunger for what humans possessed. And what humans possessed that the hidden folk desired most was children. Human children, healthy and beautiful and alive in ways that fairy children, pale, sickly, never quite thriving, were not. And so they stole, they crept into cottages at night, past thresholds that should have been protected, past iron and rowan and all the wards that should have kept them out. They took the human infant and left their own in its place, a changeling that might look like the stolen child, but was fundamentally different. The changeling did not nurse properly. It cried constantly, or it did not cry at all. It watched with ancient eyes. It failed to grow, failed to speak, failed to become what human children become. What we recognize now in these descriptions breaks the heart. The symptoms of changeling belief match conditions we have names for: failure to thrive, developmental disabilities, autism, genetic disorders that affect appearance and behavior, childhood illnesses that transformed previously healthy infants into something their parents could not understand. Medieval people had no vocabulary for these conditions, no framework for understanding why some children were different, why some did not develop as expected, why the baby they had welcomed became stranger they could not reach. The changeling explanation provided answers. It explained why this had happened. The fairies had done it, not God, not punishment for sin, not random chance. It explained what had changed. This was not the same child, not the child they had loved, not the child they had expected. And it suggested remedies, ways to recover the stolen infant, ways to force the fairies to reverse the exchange, ways to restore what had been lost. The remedies were often cruel. Some traditions held that changelings could be exposed by making them laugh or speak, revealing their true ancient nature. A mother might brew eggshells, pretend to make beer in them, and the changeling, unable to resist commenting on something so absurd, would exclaim, "I am old, so old, but I have never seen beer brewed in eggshells," and thus reveal itself. Other remedies were worse, placing the suspected changeling on a shovel over the fire, reasoning that fairies feared iron and flame, abandoning the child at crossroads overnight, believing the fairies would reclaim their own and return the human infant, beating the changeling, starving it, subjecting it to treatment no child should endure, all in the desperate hope that the fairies would take back their creature and return the real child who was missed, who was mourned, who was still waiting somewhere in the fairy hills for parents who would not give up. Children died from these remedies. Children were killed by parents who loved them but could not accept them, who believed the cruel treatment was directed not at their own child but at the impostor who had taken their child's place. The records preserve some of their names, some of their stories, trials where parents were charged with harming children they insisted were not truly theirs. The belief provided framework for denial, for rejection, for violence that grief and confusion made possible. But beneath the cruelty lay genuine suffering. The suffering of parents who could not understand why their child had changed, who searched for explanations where no explanations existed, who would have done anything to recover the baby they remembered. The changeling belief was not random cruelty. It was an attempt to make sense of loss that made no sense, to find agency where there was only chance, to preserve hope that somewhere the real child still lived and might still be recovered. The belief faded as medicine advanced, as conditions received names and treatments, as the mysterious changes that transformed children became understood as illness or disability rather than fairy theft. Today we do not blame fairies when development differs from expectation. We have specialists and therapies and support systems that did not exist in medieval cottages. We have understanding that they lacked, compassion that they struggled to maintain in the face of mystery. But something of the old grief persists, the sense that the child we expected is not the child we received. The mourning for what we imagined before reality arrived. The adjustment that every parent of every child must make between the dream and the actual, between the anticipated and the present. The changelings are gone, explained away by knowledge that medieval parents could not possess. But the longing remains, the wish that things were different, the hope that somewhere the child we imagined still exists, the slow and difficult work of loving the child who is here rather than the child who was never more than dream. In the shadow of medieval gallows, where the condemned swung in chains until flesh fell from bone and bone became lesson to those who passed below, there grew, according to belief, a plant of terrible power. The mandrake, with its forked root that resembled the human form, its leaves like spread hands reaching from the earth, was said to germinate where the bodily fluids of the hanged dripped into the soil. It was nourished by execution. It grew from death. And when pulled from the ground it screamed, a shriek so dreadful that any who heard it directly would die upon the spot. The belief was ancient and widespread. Josephus wrote of the mandrake in the 1st century. Hildegard of Bingen discussed its properties in the 12th. Throughout the medieval period, the mandrake occupied strange territory between medicine and magic, between natural plant and something more, a thing that seemed almost alive, almost aware, almost capable of protest when disturbed. The root itself invited the comparison. Mandrake roots naturally fork, creating shapes that with little imagination suggest arm and legs, torso and head. Some roots seemed male, others female. Charlatans enhanced the resemblance, carving features, adding hair made from grass or grain, selling the results as genuine mandrakes to those who could not find or could not risk harvesting their own. The market for mandrakes was real, because the uses were believed to be many: fertility charm, love potion ingredient, anesthetic for surgery, cure for numerous ailments, protection against evil spirits, aid to prosperity and luck. But the harvest was dangerous. The scream could not be heard without consequence. And so elaborate rituals developed for safe extraction. The ground around the mandrake was loosened, but the root was not pulled by human hand. Instead, a dog was brought to the gallows shadow, a dog tied by rope to the mandrake's stalk, a dog called away by its master who had stuffed his ears with wax or fled beyond the scream's reach. The dog, obeying the call, pulled the mandrake free. The mandrake screamed. The dog died. But the harvester survived, and the root with all its power was his. The sacrifice of the dog, a creature used to extract something too dangerous for humans to touch, echoes through the ritual like a dark note. The medieval relationship with animals was complex. They were property, were food, were workers, were sometimes loved, but were rarely granted the moral standing that would make their sacrifice troubling in the way the sacrifice of a human would be. The dog was expendable. The mandrake was not. The transaction made sense within a worldview that ranked beings by their usefulness and their proximity to human soul. What the mandrake actually did, separated from legend, was real enough. The plant contains tropane alkaloids, scopolamine and atropine, that have genuine psychoactive and anesthetic properties. Medieval physicians used mandrake for pain relief, for sedation before surgery, for inducing sleep. The drowsiness it produced, the strange visions it could generate, the altered states it created, all these effects were real, were observable, were useful. The mystical properties attributed to the plant were built upon a foundation of actual pharmacological effect. But the scream? The death of all who heard it? These were elaborations, were additions that transformed a powerful plant into something supernatural, something that required ritual and sacrifice to obtain. Perhaps the danger served a purpose, made the mandrake more valuable by making it more difficult to acquire, protected the supply from casual harvesting, ensured that only those serious enough to perform the ritual would attempt to obtain what lay beneath the gallows' shadow. Or perhaps the scream expressed something true about the plant's origins. It grew where the hanged had died. It was nourished by their fluids, their decay, their final moments of suffering. The mandrake was, in a sense, the distillation of violent death, the transformation of execution into botanical form. If such a plant could be said to have a voice, what sound would it make but the cry of those whose deaths had given it life? The gallows are gone now, or transformed into historical sites where tourists gather rather than crowds assembled to witness punishment. The mandrake still grows, still forks into shapes that suggest the human form, still contains the alkaloids that made it medically useful. But we no longer harvest it with dogs and wax-stopped ears. We no longer believe that death lurks in its extraction. We have separated the plant from the myth, the chemistry from the magic, the root from the scream. Yet something of the old belief lingers in how we think about powerful substances still. The sense that what heals can also harm. The awareness that effective medicines often come from dangerous sources. The intuition that to extract benefit from nature sometimes requires sacrifice, requires risk, requires confronting forces that would rather remain undisturbed. The mandrake no longer screams, but the knowledge that power and danger intertwine, that the most potent things often lie in the darkest places, that to reach for healing is sometimes to traffic with death. This knowledge remains, a truth the medieval world expressed through legend that we express through warnings and protocols, and the careful controls we place upon substances that could cure or kill depending on the dose. In the folk belief of medieval England, Ireland, and France, there existed a hierarchy of birth that carried supernatural weight. Position in the sequence of siblings was not mere accident, but was destiny, and the most powerful position of all belonged to the seventh son of a seventh son. Such a person, born after 6 brothers in an unbroken chain of male births, was believed to possess healing powers from birth. No training was required, no ordination, no study of medical texts or apprenticeship with physicians. The gift was in the blood, in the sequence, in the sacred mathematics of family. The power was specific. The seventh son could cure the king's evil, scrofula we would call it now, a form of tuberculosis that affected the lymph nodes, causing swelling and disfigurement, chronic illness that persisted for years, that medieval medicine could not effectively treat. The seventh son needed only to touch the afflicted area, his hands upon the swollen glands, his breath upon the diseased flesh, his presence in the same room as the suffering. These were believed to be enough. The disease would fade. The patient would heal. The gift would be confirmed. The belief reflected a broader medieval understanding that the physical world was saturated with spiritual significance. Numbers were not arbitrary. 7 was sacred, was the days of creation, was the sacraments, was the deadly sins and heavenly virtues, was completion and holiness encoded in mathematics. A sequence of 7 sons, each seventh in his own generation, concentrated this sacredness in a single individual. The concentration produced power. The power manifested as healing. The parallel with royal touch made the belief more plausible. Kings of England and France, from the medieval period into the 18th century, were believed to possess the power to cure scrofula through their anointed hands. Edward the Confessor was credited with the gift. The ceremony was elaborate. Monarchs would touch hundreds, sometimes thousands of sufferers, would distribute coins as evidence of the healing bestowed. The practice was so common that scrofula itself was called the king's evil, the disease that kings could cure. The 7th son was the peasant version of this royal gift. What monarchs possessed through divine appointment, the 7th son possessed through divine mathematics. Both versions rested on the same assumption, that certain individuals, through birth or anointing, carried within them a power that could not be learned, could not be purchased, could only be received as gift and exercised as calling. And some did exercise it. Records survive of 7th sons who made their living as healers, who traveled from village to village, offering their touch to those afflicted with scrofula and other ailments. Some charged for their services. Others accepted only what the healed chose to give. Some were revered as local saints. Others were suspected of witchcraft, their power ambiguous in a world where any supernatural ability might come from either God or devil. Did the healing work? The question is both simple and complex. Scrofula, as a form of tuberculosis, can go into remission on its own. Symptoms can wax and wane over months or years. A touch received during a period of hope, in the context of belief and community support, might coincide with natural improvement that would have occurred regardless. The belief that one had been healed might itself affect how symptoms were perceived and reported. The psychological dimension of healing, the comfort of being touched, of being seen, of receiving the full attention of someone believed to have power. This dimension is real, is measurable, is present in healing encounters across every tradition. So perhaps some did feel better after the 7th son's touch. Perhaps some recovered from what might have resolved anyway. Perhaps the belief itself had power, not supernatural power, but the ordinary power of hope and community, and the simple human need to believe that help is possible when suffering seems endless. What we cannot know is what it felt like to be the 7th son, to be born into a role you did not choose, marked from infancy as different, expected to perform miracles you could not understand, and perhaps could not control. Did they believe in their own power? Did they feel the healing flow through their hands, or did they perform a ritual they suspected was empty? Did they rejoice in the good they might do, or did they carry the weight of every patient who did not improve, every hope they failed to fulfill? The 7th son is gone now, absorbed into a world that no longer counts siblings with supernatural significance, that no longer expects healing from touch alone. But the longing remains, the wish that some among us might carry gifts that could ease our suffering, that healing might be simple, that power might flow from person to person through nothing more than presence and intention. The physicians have replaced the seventh sons. The antibiotics have replaced the touch. But somewhere in the hope we bring to every doctor's office, every healer's hands, every person we believe might help us. Somewhere in that hope lives the shadow of the seventh son, the faith that healing can come from those blessed by forces we do not understand. Above doorways throughout medieval Europe, and persisting into the present in farmhouses and cottages where old ways linger, horseshoes were nailed with their ends pointing upward, forming a crescent believed to ward off witches, evil spirits, and malevolent forces that might otherwise enter freely. The practice was so widespread, so deeply embedded, that even churches bore horseshoes above their doors. The sacred and the superstitious intertwined in iron, mounted on stone. The logic was layered. Iron itself was believed to have power over the supernatural world. Fairies feared it. Cold iron, the folklore called it, the metal that could wound what ordinary steel could not touch. Spirits were repelled by iron's presence, could not cross thresholds where iron stood guard, could not work their mischief in homes protected by the metal that had conquered the ages of stone and bronze. The blacksmith, who worked with fire and iron daily, was regarded as figure of power, someone who stood at the boundary between ordinary craft and something older, someone whose work with primal elements gave him authority over forces that ordinary folk could not command. The horseshoe combined iron's power with additional protections. Its crescent shape echoed the moon, sacred in traditions older than Christianity, associated with the goddess who governed night and change, and the hidden things that moved in darkness. The horseshoe's association with horses added further meaning. Horses were noble creatures, expensive and powerful, associated with warfare and status, symbols of strength that might be invoked for protection. And the horseshoe was found rather than made specifically for the purpose. The best protective horseshoes, according to tradition, were those discovered by chance, gifts of fortune that carried luck within their very acquisition. The positioning mattered. In most traditions, the horseshoe hung with ends pointing upward, creating a cup that would hold the luck in, keeping good fortune from draining away. But some traditions reversed this, pointing the ends downward so that luck would pour out upon those who passed beneath, blessing all who entered with the protection the iron contained. The disagreement was never resolved, perhaps because both orientations seemed to work, perhaps because the power was in the iron itself rather than in its angle, perhaps because local custom trumped universal logic in matters of folk belief. The number of nails securing the horseshoe also carried meaning. 7 nails were considered ideal by many traditions, 7 being the number of completion, of sacredness, of cosmic significance. A horseshoe properly mounted with 7 nails concentrated protective power at every point of attachment, created a shield that held firm against whatever forces might test it. Other traditions counted differently, but the attention to number testified to the seriousness with which the protection was treated. What were they protecting against? The threats were multiple. Witches who might curse the household or its livestock, evil spirits who might bring illness or misfortune, the evil eye, that look of envy or malice that could blight crops and sicken children, fairies who might steal infants or sour milk or lead travelers astray. The medieval world was populated with dangers invisible but potent, forces that wished humanity ill, powers that could be opposed only through the proper deployment of symbols and substances that they feared. The horseshoe answered these threats with the simplicity of available materials. Not everyone could afford elaborate protections, blessed objects from distant shrines, relics of saints, the attentions of priests. But almost everyone could find a horseshoe. The roads were heavy with horse traffic, and shoes came loose, were thrown, were replaced and discarded. A found horseshoe was free protection, available to the peasant as well as the lord. Democratic in a way that other defenses were not. The practice persists. Drive through rural areas today, and you will see horseshoes above doorways still, some mounted by residents who believe as their ancestors believed, others placed as decoration, or as acknowledgement of tradition whose origins have been forgotten. The protection continues to be invoked even by those who would laugh if asked whether they actually feared witches. The iron holds its post. The threshold is guarded. Whatever walks in darkness finds the crescent mounted and waiting. And perhaps there is wisdom in the persistence, not because witches are real in the way medieval people believed, not because evil spirits literally cannot cross iron-protected thresholds, but because the practice itself addresses something genuine, the human need to protect what we love, to mark our homes as places of safety, to believe that some barrier exists between the dangers of the outside world and the vulnerable space where we sleep and gather and raise our children. The horseshoe answers this need. It stands as symbol of our refusal to be helpless, our determination to act against whatever threatens, our faith that protection is possible even when we cannot fully name what we are protecting against. The blacksmith's work endures. The crescent hangs above the door, and something in us still responds to the sight, still feels, however faintly, the reassurance of iron mounted in its place, guardian against forces that the rational mind denies but the dreaming mind still fears. In the courts of medieval Europe, the accused were not always human. Pigs that killed children, rats that devoured stored grain, weevils that consumed crops, roosters that laid eggs, an impossibility that nonetheless warranted investigation and judgment. All could be summoned before judges, represented by lawyers, tried according to established legal procedure, and if found guilty, executed or excommunicated with all the solemnity accorded to human justice. The animal trials were not mockery, not theater, not legal curiosity for the entertainment of bored courts. They were earnest proceedings, recorded in documents that survive to astonish us, conducted by judges and lawyers who believed they were fulfilling genuine obligation. The charge would be read, the defense would be mounted, the evidence would be considered, the verdict would be rendered, and the sentence would be carried out, hanging for domestic animals, excommunication, or formal curse for vermin that could not be individually caught and killed. The pig trials are most numerous and most disturbing. Pigs wandered freely in medieval villages, scavenging through streets, entering homes where doors stood open, coming upon unattended infants with tragic frequency. When a pig killed or injured a child, the animal was arrested, physically restrained, held in custody, brought before the court in chains as any human defendant might be. The charge was murder. The evidence was the injury or death. The defense, for the pig was entitled to legal representation, might argue that the animal had acted without malice, that it lacked the capacity for criminal intent. that it should be treated with mercy despite the harm it had caused. But the verdicts were usually guilty, and the sentences were carried out with elaborate ceremony. The pig might be dressed in human clothing, vest and gloves and sometimes hat, as if to emphasize that it was being treated as the human criminal it was replacing in the dock. It would be led to the scaffold. The executioner would perform his office. The crowd would witness justice done. The records would note that the law had been satisfied. Why? The question presses from across the centuries. Why treat animals as moral agents? Why give them trials they could not understand, defenses that made no sense for beings without reason, sentences that seemed to assume guilt of a kind that only humans can bear? One explanation is legal. Medieval law required a response to harm. An injury demanded accountability. A death demanded justice. When a pig killed a child, the community could not simply shrug. Something had to be done. Someone or something had to answer. The trial provided framework for that answer, transformed grief and outrage into procedure, allowed the community to process what had happened through ritual that imposed order on chaos. Another explanation is theological. The medieval worldview understood all of creation as existing within moral framework. Animals were not random, were not mere matter, were creatures of God occupying assigned places in cosmic hierarchy. When an animal disrupted that hierarchy, when it took human life, it had violated the order that God had established. The trial was response not just to the immediate harm, but to the cosmic disorder that the harm represented. A third explanation is pragmatic. The trial and execution of a dangerous animal removed that animal from the community. The pig that had killed once might kill again. The sentence addressed future threat as well as past harm. The elaborate procedure legitimized what might otherwise have been simple slaughter, transformed necessary action into legal act, protected those who killed the animal from any charge that they had acted without authority. And then there were the insect trials, the cases where rats or weevils or other vermin were summoned before ecclesiastical courts, represented by lawyers who argued earnestly on their behalf, subjected to excommunication or curse when they failed to appear or failed to cease their depredations. These trials seem even stranger than the pig cases. How does one summon a swarm? How does one excommunicate a beetle? But the trials had purpose. They demonstrated that the Church had authority over all of creation, that its jurisdiction extended to creatures great and small, that nothing existed outside the moral order it administered. They provided ceremony for communities suffering crop damage they could not otherwise address. The trial and formal curse gave the feeling of action even when practical action was impossible. They expressed the medieval conviction that nature itself was part of the social and spiritual order, that even vermin had obligations to that order, that harm to humans violated something fundamental that required formal response. The last recorded animal trial occurred in the 18th century. A dog convicted of participating in robbery, executed alongside its human accomplices. The Enlightenment was already underway, and the age of animal trials was ending, replaced by legal systems that restricted moral agency to humans alone, that no longer imagined that pigs could be murderers or rats could be excommunicated. But something of the old impulse persists. We still want someone to blame when harm occurs. We still want accountability, response. the sense that wrongs have been addressed. We no longer try animals in court, but we do destroy dogs that bite, do eliminate wildlife that threatens, do impose consequences on creatures that cross the boundaries we have drawn. The trials are gone. The execution of what harms us continues. And somewhere beneath our modern framework, the medieval conviction lingers that the world should make sense, that harm should be answered, that even beings without understanding of justice should somehow be subject to it. When theft occurred in a medieval village, when grain vanished from the common store, when coins disappeared from the counting house, when precious objects could not be found, and when the culprit hid among the innocent, wearing the same face as the honest, sharing the same bread as those they had wronged, the community sometimes turned to the bread itself for justice. This was the trial by korsned, from the Anglo-Saxon words for oath and morsel, the ordeal of blessed bread that would reveal what human investigation could not discover. The procedure was simple in its elements and profound in its implications. A piece of bread, usually barley bread, was consecrated by a priest. Prayers spoken over it, blessings invoked, the ordinary substance transformed by sacred words into instrument of divine judgment. The suspects, all who might have committed the theft, all who denied their guilt, were gathered. One by one they approached. The priest placed the consecrated morsel in each mouth. The accused chewed, the accused swallowed, and the watching community waited to see what God would reveal. If the bread went down easily, if the suspect swallowed without difficulty, then innocence was indicated. The body had accepted what was blessed. The soul harbored no guilt that would prevent the sacred from passing through. But if the suspect choked, if the bread stuck in the throat, if swallowing became impossible, if the morsel refused to be consumed, then guilt was manifest. The body itself had testified. The truth had emerged from flesh that could not be compelled to lie. The theology was precise. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of medieval Christianity, transformed bread into the body of Christ. Consecrated bread was therefore holy, was touched by divine presence, was substance that partook of the sacred in ways ordinary bread did not. And the sacred could not coexist with sin. A soul stained by guilt, a person carrying the weight of unconfessed transgression, could not receive what was holy. The body would rebel. The throat would close. The communion of blessed and guilty was impossible. The psychology was equally precise, though in ways the medieval practitioners did not articulate. Fear closes throats. Guilt produces anxiety that manifests physically. A person who knows they are guilty, who approaches the trial knowing the bread should choke them, who believes with the certainty of faith that God will reveal their crime, such a person might well find swallowing difficult. The expectation of choking might produce the choking. The belief in the ordeal might make the ordeal work. But what of the innocent who were nervous? What of those falsely accused, whose terror at being suspected might produce the same physical symptoms as guilt? What of those whose throats were dry with fear, whose bodies refused to cooperate with minds that knew themselves blameless? The korsned made no allowances for psychology, drew no distinctions between the choking of guilt and the choking of terror. Innocence wrongly convicted was attributed to hidden sins, perhaps to guilt the innocent themselves did not recognize, to the mysterious workings of divine judgment that humans could not fully comprehend. The ordeal was not unique to bread. Trial by water, where the accused was thrown into blessed water, and floating indicated guilt because pure water rejected the impure, operated on similar principles. Trial by fire, where the accused carried heated iron, and the healing or festering of the burns indicated innocence or guilt, trusted the same divine intervention. Trial by combat, where disputants fought, and victory indicated God's favor toward the truthful party, assumed the same universe where justice was not merely human concern, but divine guarantee. All these ordeals assumed that God would intervene in human justice, that he could not permit the innocent to suffer, that he would reveal truth when human investigation failed, that the universe was fundamentally moral, was actively governed, was responsive to the needs of communities seeking to distinguish right from wrong. The faith was enormous. The stakes were absolute. The bread that stuck in the throat could mean death, exile, loss of everything that made life livable. The ordeals faded as the medieval period ended. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, removing the ecclesiastical blessing that had made the practices possible. Slowly, secular courts developed alternative methods: evidence, testimony, investigation, the tools that would eventually become modern legal procedure. The blessed bread was set aside. The divine intervention was no longer invoked. Justice became human responsibility, for better and worse. But the longing persists, the wish that truth could be so simply discovered, the hope that the guilty would be compelled to reveal themselves, that the universe itself would separate the innocent from the culpable. We no longer choke suspects with blessed bread, but we still seek technologies of truth, lie detectors, voice stress analysis, brain scanning, each promising to reveal what words might hide. The corsned is gone. The quest for certainty in a world of deception continues. And perhaps the bread understood something we have lost. Perhaps there was wisdom in the ritual that made justice communal, that gathered suspects and witnesses and the whole village together, that created ceremony around the question of who had wronged whom. The modern lie detector is administered in private rooms by technicians. The corsned was administered in the presence of all, making justice visible, making the community participant in the discovery of truth. Something was lost when the bread was set aside. The efficiency of modern procedure cannot quite replace what the ritual provided. The sense that truth mattered to everyone, that the community itself was seeking to heal the wound that theft had made. In the chronicles of medieval England, there appear accounts that differ from ordinary ghost stories. These are not tales of spirits glimpsed in passing, of voices heard in empty rooms, of transparent figures that fade when approached. These are accounts of revenants, corpses that rose from graves and walked among the living, not as spirits but as physical bodies, animated by purposes unknown, spreading fear and sometimes disease through villages that could not return them to rest. William of Newburgh, writing in the late 12th century, documented multiple cases with the careful attention of a historian who believed himself recording fact. He named names, specified places, described investigations conducted by bishops and local authorities who took the reports seriously enough to act upon them. The accounts share certain features: a recent death, often of someone notorious for wickedness in life, disturbed earth above the grave, footprints leading from the cemetery to the village, witnesses who saw the corpse walking, often at night, sometimes entering homes where the living cowered. The revenant was not ghost but body, physical, solid, capable of being touched if anyone dared, capable of leaving traces of its passage, capable of the weight and presence that spirits lack. This was the distinguishing horror. Not the possibility that the dead might appear, but the certainty that the dead had returned in flesh, that what should have been rotting in the grave was instead walking the lanes where the living walked, carrying whatever purposes or hungers had drawn it back from death. What caused such return? The medieval explanations varied. Some believed the revenant was animated by unfinished business, wrongs unavenged, debts unpaid, promises unkept. The soul could not rest while such matters remained unsettled, and so it drove the body upward, broke through the earth, walked the familiar paths seeking resolution it could not find. Others believed the return was punishment. The wicked were denied rest, were condemned to wander as their victims had suffered, were displayed to the living as warnings of what awaited those who died in sin. Still others feared that the revenant was not truly the person who had died, but something else, a demon that had occupied the empty shell, an evil spirit that used the corpse as vehicle, animating what should have been still for purposes that were not human and could not be good. This explanation was perhaps most terrifying, for it suggested that the dead themselves were vulnerable to possession, that even death did not free the body from the possibility of being used. The remedies were specific and extreme. When a revenant was identified, the body had to be exhumed, no small undertaking in an age when graves were sacred, when disturbing the dead was sin, when the very act of opening a coffin might be spiritually dangerous. The corpse was examined for signs of abnormality, blood around the mouth, flesh that had not decayed as expected, eyes that seemed somehow still aware. Then the body was destroyed, burned completely, reduced to ash that could not reconstitute, or the heart was removed and burned separately, or a stake was driven through the chest to pin the corpse to the earth it had escaped. The accounts describe these procedures with the matter-of-fact detail of medical reports. The body of such and such, found in such condition, treated in such manner, with such result. The revenant was laid to rest. The village returned to peace. The grave remained quiet thereafter. The procedures worked, or at least were believed to work, which in a world where belief shaped reality may have amounted to the same thing. What did medieval people actually encounter? The question invites modern explanations. Premature burial, more common in an age without sophisticated means of confirming death, might produce movements, sounds, the appearance of escape from the grave. Gases of decomposition might cause corpses to shift, to seem to move, to produce sounds that could be interpreted as signs of animation. Disease, particularly plague, which killed quickly and left bodies in states that might be misinterpreted, might spread from corpses to those who handled them, creating apparent contagion from the revenant's touch. But these explanations, however plausible, do not quite account for the specificity of the accounts, the consistency of the descriptions, the earnestness with which bishops and lords investigated and acted. Something was happening that the medieval world could only explain as the dead returning. Whether that something was misinterpretation of natural phenomena, genuine encounters with things we cannot explain, or the power of belief to shape experience, this we cannot know. The accounts remain. The explanations we offer are our own, no more certain than the explanations they offered, perhaps no more accurate to whatever truth the revenants represented. What persists is the fear itself, the ancient fear that death might not be final, that the grave might not hold, that those we have buried might find their way back to us, changed by whatever they experienced in the darkness, no longer quite the people we knew, perhaps no longer people at all. We tell ourselves that death ends things, that the corpse is merely matter, that nothing returns from beyond that threshold. But somewhere in the quiet hours, when sleep is slow to come and the house settles into silence, the old fear stirs. The revenant walks still, at least in imagination, at least in the stories we cannot quite stop telling. The dead we have loved or feared might find the path back. The grave might open, the door might creak, and in the darkness, something that was buried might be standing, watching, waiting for us to acknowledge that death is not always the end of presence. Conclusion. The night deepens, and the medieval world recedes, fading like mist at dawn, leaving behind only impressions. The sound of bells through storm, the weight of iron above a threshold, the silence of churchyards where the buried may or may not remain. We have wandered through a world that believed differently than we believe, that feared things we no longer name, that sought protections we no longer need, or no longer know we need. What are we to make of these strange beliefs? It would be easy to dismiss them, to feel the comfort of our modern certainties, to congratulate ourselves on having escaped the superstitions that haunted our ancestors. But such dismissal misses what the beliefs reveal, that human beings have always faced an uncertain world, have always sought to understand what could not be understood, have always created rituals and precautions and stories to address the fears that reason could not resolve. The medieval mind was not less intelligent than ours. It was differently equipped. It had observation and pattern recognition, but not microscopes. It had faith and tradition, but not controlled experiments. It had the accumulated wisdom of generations, but not the scientific method that would eventually transform how humans investigate the world. Within the constraints of what they knew, medieval people acted rationally, seeking causes for effects, developing explanations that made sense of observed phenomena, creating practices that seemed to work, or at least provided the comfort of action in the face of helplessness. And perhaps we have not changed as much as we imagine. We still fear what we cannot control. We still seek certainties where certainties cannot be found. We still perform rituals, knocking on wood, crossing fingers, avoiding number 13, whose origins we have forgotten, but whose comfort we still seek. We still wonder, in the quiet moments when rationality loosens its grip, whether the world is stranger than our explanations allow, whether there are forces at work that our science has not yet named, whether the medieval mind glimpsed something true that our enlightened age has simply agreed to ignore. Sleep comes now, the bells hang silent, the horseshoes keep their watch, the graves remain closed, or do not. How would we know in the darkness? The world beyond our windows holds whatever it holds. Weather we have learned to explain, forces we have learned to name, and perhaps something else, something older, something that remembers a time when humans knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to stop the fear. Let the strange beliefs of the Middle Ages accompany us into sleep, not as errors to be corrected, but as testimony to be honored, testimony to human courage in the face of the incomprehensible, human creativity in the face of helplessness, human hope that the world makes sense even when sense is hard to find. Our ancestors were not fools. They were people like us, making their way through darkness, doing the best they could with what they had, believing what their world taught them to believe. And in the morning, when light returns and rationality reasserts itself, we will move through our day with our modern understandings, our scientific explanations, our confident certainties. But somewhere in the back of the mind, the medieval world will linger, a reminder that we too are making our way through darkness, that we too have beliefs future generations may find strange, that we too are doing the best we can with what we have, trusting explanations that may prove incomplete, protected by precautions that may prove insufficient. The candles dim, the threshold is crossed back into the present, and the medieval night, with all its strange fears and stranger comforts, releases us at last into sleep. That small death we practice every night, that journey into darkness from which we trust we will return, that threshold between worlds that we cross with barely a thought, taking for granted the return that our ancestors never quite dared assume. Sleep well. The bells will not ring against the thunder. The mirrors are uncovered. The horseshoe hangs in place. And whatever walked in medieval darkness walks there no longer, or walks still, but in the dreams we share with ancestors across the centuries, dreams of a world where nothing was merely what it seemed, where danger was everywhere, where protection was possible, where faith was the only light in the long night of not knowing. Rest now. The strange beliefs have been told. The darkness holds no more terrors than it ever held. And tomorrow is another day in a world that still contains mysteries, still offers fears, still invites us to make sense of what defies sense, to find courage when courage seems impossible, to believe that somehow, despite everything, we are not alone in the darkness. Good night.